Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the overall issues of organic supply and demand and artificially structured supply and demand. Now, there's no economy in the world that's absolutely running just on open-ended laissez-faire of supply and demand decides everything. There's similarly, no economy in the world where everything down to the tiniest minute detail is planned. Typically, there's somewhere in between. Even the communists, the most rabid communist societies had small little pockets of areas in say agriculture. Even at the height of the Soviet era, they still had something like 5% of the agriculture was in private hands. Particularly with things like growing herbs like garlic and parsley, things like that. But most of the big ticket stuff, close to all of it, was planned. But some of the incidental things that the planners weren't really interested in, and they didn't think they had an ideological sort of overtone about it, then that could be left in private hands. But nonetheless, when we look at the issue of supply and demand now, the initial concept of supply and demand wasn't based on a worldwide market or worldwide access to labor or worldwide access to capital or these sorts of things. Not that those things weren't issues in the past, particularly sort of as the industrial age kicked off. But the concept of supply and demand was that your citizens would be both the supply and demand, so that your workers would wages would be relative to the demand for workers, and prices would be relative to the capacity of the local citizenry to purchase things. That's why in real estate, the prices of real estate, whether it be rent or to purchase, stayed remarkably consistent with wages until well after the post-World War II era. So, and the relationship began to change only because of the amount of credit you could get to buy property, whereas it had been typically related to how much money you had, how much money you'd saved. Was this idea of having anything less than 25 or 30% of the purchase price of a property was really quite unthinkable until certainly in Australia until really the 1980s. And that's when things began to change. That's when people could buy a property with say 10% down, and the authorities turned a general blind eye to if you borrowed your deposits from, so you borrowed a deposit from one bank but then get the mortgage from a different bank. That hitherto was effectively not allowed, but then things like that were allowed. So those are things that did affect supply and demand, no question. But the big hit to supply and demand came with the globalist program for mass migration. Now, even where you have 10 people from India living in one apartment or something like that, their combined purchasing power, their combined spending power, even if they're all working as part-time cleaners or something, is still greater than one or two income white households. So, and the property owners exploited that to the max, saying, well, there are 10 of you here, which is not allowed, by the way. That's against local statutes. You have a maximum of 4 people in a place like that. But they had 10 of them or more of them, 15, 20 of them. And so the landlords would exploit this, the property owners would exploit this, and so, well, because there's more of you in there, I'm going to put a 50% bounty on the rent. So instead of $100 a week in rent, you guys, because there's so many of you there, you can pay 150. So all sorts of artificial non-market forces things began to occur. None of these things are natural market forces. The mass influx of people, the amount of people living in one property being well beyond what is permitted under the local statutes and ordinances and the laws. So this had an effect, had a huge effect, because it was no longer the local citizens and their spending power, purchasing power, that was dictating what the rents would be. But now it was something completely different and coming from outside of the supply-demand nexus. And this is where the globalists have imposed a non supply and demand discipline on the economy. That's gone out the window. And I'll touch on more areas in a moment. But when you look at say, there were properties that were you could rent. This is before COVID. You could rent for $150 a week that are now $800 or $900 a week. Properties were $250 a week and now over $1,000 a week to rent, and property prices too, obviously going much higher in most places. Not so much the far outer suburbs, but them too. There were houses that not long ago, and certainly as I remember, what you could purchase for $25,000. Those properties now are $400,000, and this is 5 hours drive outside of Sydney, in a town of less than 50,000 people. You got to pay 400. Hardly anyone in that town has that sort of income, or they can afford to buy that sort of property. So all the money is coming from outside, and all the purchasing power. None of it is reflected in the local economy. Now, one of the things that was certainly, as I remember as a younger man, was that the local pricing of not only property but other things too would reflect the local purchasing power of that community. Now that's all changed, so that it's the international purchasing power of money coming in from, I don't know, the globalist banking system, the Chinese, Communist Party goons, the rich Brahmins out of India with their monopolies and so on. That's where the purchasing power is now coming into the West, and the prices reflect that. Now, it's also market rigging on a grand scale. There's a regional city in Australia where the real estate prices in just a few years increased by close on 400%. They'd lain dormant for quite a while the rest of Sydney real estate was going hysterical. But this smaller regional city, the real estate prices are more or less the same. And at the same time, the economy in this city was taking a hit because the manufacturing was closing down, going offshore, this sort of thing. This was a big manufacturing hub at the time, and unemployment went through the roof. And that there was less than, like, if you look at, say, the top 1% of incomes in Australia, this city had 1/50th of the top incomes in Australia, even though it had what would it have been, 3% of the population of the country, something like that. So that goes to show there's hardly anybody, even if you look at the average wage, it had only 10% of the workers in that city made above the average wage. That shows what a poor place it was and how little purchasing power. Yet during that same time as purchasing power was going through the floor, the real estate prices were going through the roof. Now, it just couldn't happen. The locals can't buy that. They don't have the money to do it. And then on top of that, the amount of time it was taking for properties to sell more than doubled. So the purchasing power of the local population is going through the floor. The time to sell a property is doubling, and yet properties increased by 400% in less than 10 years. Now, how can that possibly happen? It can't. In market forces, economic forces, that cannot happen. It's mathematically impossible. But yet there it was. And I mention this to illustrate the extent of the subversion and the corruption of supply and demand, as in textbook supply and demand market forces, just simply weren't applying here. Now, there are a few areas where the globalists in particular, if wages are increasing, they scream inflation. Inflation is terrible. The end of the world is nigh. We got to bring in fuckloads of illiterate third world peasants. That'll fix it. And they say, but what we'll do, instead of calling them illiterate third world mud hut peasants, we'll call them rocket scientists and they're skilled rocket scientists. Yes, sure they are. And so we'll bring in masses of people here. But this has the effect of creating artificial economies that otherwise wouldn't exist without slave peasant labour. So again, market forces not operating, and it artificially depresses wages. Now, just reading articles from the various business focus groups or business groups and so on, stuff that's not necessarily widely circulated in the media, is that if I don't know, if a company advertises for a technician, even say a skilled technician, and they get 25 applicants, all of whom can do the job, they will assume that's a disaster. No, we need, it needs to be well over 100. We need to be swamped in qualified applicants, so we can just rando pick and choose anyone we want based on attitude or anything we want, based on that they'll work for half the normal wage and so on and so forth. So again, there's this demand to subvert natural market forces. Now, what natural market forces do, they impose disciplines. They impose structures on, when I say impose, create the conditions for is maybe what I mean. So if you've got people, not many people applying for the job, it's difficult to attract talent. Then you try and attract that talent or that capability or those skills or that knowledge, whatever you want to call it. You try and attract them by you can pay them more, offer them better conditions, offer them better, I don't know, a nicer office or gym membership or something like that. But whatever it might be, but you offer those things. But instead, the reverse is the case now, where no company needs to do anything to particularly attract capable people. They can hand out gym memberships on the basis of black lesbian victim points, but not on the basis of capability. So this is an inversion of the market forces that otherwise would apply. So whenever you get a small cabal that determines that, well, as long as our cost inputs will be where inflation is, so they can say, well, we've got to put up our price if we have to pay more for the workers. Therefore, it sets off a cycle of inflation. We can't have that. We've got to have mass migration. But if they want to increase their prices without the cost inputs increasing, then they're just profit making and running their business as they should, and we supply a better product. That they can claim all sorts of things that are also inflationary, but they're not accountable for. Oh, it's just somehow the market. So when it suits them, they scream it's the market that's doing it. It's supply and demand. That's all it is. But when it doesn't suit them, they can corrupt and subvert supply and demand. But the end result is they're not solving anything. They're not creating new wealth. They're not creating more efficient structures. They're not doing any of that. Instead, they're just moving the costs around. So instead of them shouldering the costs or bearing the costs, they're simply transferring it to the populace. This is particularly the case with the financial sector. So they're able to profit massively from the real estate prices. But all they've done is transfer what otherwise would have been a need for them to redesign or redevelop their organizational structures and reconfigure their business model, and just simply, no, we'll keep it as it is. We'll just rig the market and we'll force the populace to wear the cost. So all the reduction in living standards of the Western citizen, all that reduction in living standards has simply been moving money around into the pockets of others rather than creating any net or intrinsic value. And this is the concern with rigging the market, and why market forces won't allow that, won't permit that to, certainly not to sustain it over any period of time. Not that there can't be bubbles, there can be. But even those, if we look back at, say, the Wall Street overvaluation bubble of 1929, a lot of that was the big financial firms getting in and overplaying the hand and trying to excessively profiteer, and that was artificial. There was nothing organic in those sorts of things. We see it even to a large extent today. The US stock market and other stock markets around the world are outrageously overvalued, and yet there's cheers and clapping and general rejoicing when the stock market, as overvalued as it is, gets even more overvalued. This is nothing to celebrate, not in my view. And again, we're seeing that there's a cartel, a wolf pack of financial firms controlling the stock market prices and the transactions and trades that are made on the stock market, and this is a bad thing. So market forces, for whatever their shortcomings, they will over the course prevent the oversupply of goods, the crashing of prices. They do prevent that. Whereas managing the economy to avoid bubbles or busts and these sorts of things requires the moving around of problems within the economy. And it's effectively, certainly it is in the West today, it's the citizenry that's paying the price for that. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.